Alright, YouTubers. This is Byron Campbell, also known as Kitten Hoarder on Board Game Geek, and today I'm going to be taking you on a fantastic voyage into the unmapped western territories of the United States. The year is 1803, and you are going to be taking part in the historic Corps of Discovery, known more famously as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, because we will be playing in honor of Indigenous Peoples Day. We will be playing the fantastic game Lewis and Clark, The Expedition, which was published by Ludonaut and Asmodee. I think it's a fairly recent game. Let me grab the box for you. One thing that you notice up front about this game, it is gorgeous. The artwork is phenomenal on all sides of the box, really. And let's see, this says that it was published... originally published in 2013. According to Board Game Geek, which is information that I was not able to ascertain after turning the box upside down and all around and looking through the rules manual, but luckily BGG came through. So this is about a year old as of the date of this video, and it's a real shame because I heard a lot about this game before it came out. There was a lot of hype surrounding the game roughly around the time that it was released. And it seems to have died down a lot since then. I really haven't heard about this game recently. Nobody seems to really be playing it anymore. And I think that's a real shame because this is pretty much an utterly unique game. It's a synthesis of hand management, a hand management card game with a sort of Agricola-style worker placement game. And you can't really even say that, oh, it's a hand management game with some worker placement thrown in, or vice versa. It's really a complete synthesis of the two. Both elements of the game have equal weight, and you can, in fact, focus more on one or the other, depending on your strategy for that play session. And you could successfully... you could develop a successful strategy focusing heavily on the worker placement or focusing heavily on the resource management. There are so many paths to victory in this game, but it's really difficult to describe. It's such a unique game that I think we're just going to go straight to the rules explanation. And I'm going to do something a little bit differently for this video. It might, hopefully it'll work out and catch on, and this will be the standard format from now on. But it's a little different from my previous videos. I'm going to record two videos, and the first video is going to be this one that you're watching now, which is sort of an introduction to the game and a fairly detailed rules explanation. And then the second video is assuming that you're already familiar with the rules, just this straight session that I'm going to be recording as I play, and then my quick review at the end. So if you have played this game before, or you are already comfortable with the rules, feel free to skip right ahead to the second video, and I will post a link down below. Otherwise, let's see what Lewis and Clark is all about. Alright, so I've got the game set up for a one-player game. As with all of my playthrough videos, I'm going to be doing a solitaire variant of the game, but Lewis and Clark The Expedition happens to come with an official solitaire variant that is actually pretty fully fleshed out, as simple as it is. So I'm going to be playing with that, and just get straight to it. So, as a member of the Corps of Discovery, your goal is to make it from St. Louis, which is this space here, all the way across the country to Fort Clatsop. And how you will do that is actually a fairly complex process, but I will describe that as I explain the rules in more depth. But basically, you're going to be, through various means, moving your scout forward along the river. So this track here is, you could think of it as almost like a victory point track, but it represents the passage from St. Louis to Fort Clatsop, and you, through various actions, move forward on the river, and then, at some point during your turns, you will make camp. And when you make camp, you may, for various reasons, move back along the river, and then wherever your scout ends up, you move your camp marker up there. And the ultimate goal of the game is to get your camp marker at or beyond Fort Clatsop, which is a lot easier said than done. So just getting your scout past Fort Clatsop isn't good enough. You have to actually be able to make camp and stay ahead of that flag there, which represents the end of the track. So, how does that happen? Well, let's find out. So first thing I'm going to do is, I guess, explain a little bit of what's going on the board here. Now, as I mentioned before, this is sort of a hybrid of a hand management game and a worker placement game. So the board here represents all of your worker placement spots. And it's this weird sort of spatial compression thing going on, because if you look closely, you can see it a little better if we remove these. The entire board is a map of the United States of America. At the same time, here in the center of the board, there's sort of a zoomed-in view of a Native American village. And that is where you will be doing all of your worker placement actions. And, let's see. So that's what all of these spaces are. Over here, we have your basic resources. And there's 4 basic resources in the game. Fur, wood, food or meat, or equipment. And equipment is just sort of general trade goods, really. And I can't get enough of how awesome this board is, so let me move this fur out of the way and show you each of these places. They're completely covered up during play, but there is this cool little thematic thing that says, oh, this is where the fur comes from. They have this little dam where they've been trapping beavers or whatnot. Over here, this is where they've been working on equipment. It's sort of like a little equipment hut. Over here, this is where they've been hunting the buffalo to get the meat. Here's where they've been doing the timber processing, and so on and so forth. Then I've just completely screwed it up, but you don't mind, do you? Okay, so those are your various types of resources. There's also 2 advanced types of resources, and these are ones that you gain through various means, usually by taking these basic resources and trading them in for an advanced one. And the 2 advanced resources are canoes, which, as you can see, are right here, and horses that you get from this little corral here. So all of these white resource polygons represent horses, the blue ones represent canoes. And there are, as I mentioned before, there are various ways of moving forward along this track to get to Fort Clatsop, but in general, you spend the blue canoes to move forward on the river spaces, and then at some point you're going to hit the mountains, and this is where things get really tricky, because you're going to have to switch tactics and spend these white horses to cross the mountains. And then you're going to hit the river again, and you'll have to switch tactics again, and then cross a few more mountains before you get to the fort. For various reasons, that is a lot easier said than done. Mostly because, you might spend a few horses to get into the mountains, and then you have to make camp, and you end up back in the river again. So you have to have access to both resources once you get into these spaces. Whereas for the early game, you can really get by with just the canoes. Okay. How does a basic turn work in Lewis and Clark? You have this hand of characters, and these are basically the people in your core of discovery. And everybody starts the game with an identical hand of 6 characters. Although the actual characters are all based on historical figures, and they are all different depending on which color you have. I have the purple ones, so I have John Collins, Hugh Hall, John Potts, William Werner, Charles Floyd, and Jean-Baptiste Lepage, who is going to be my interpreter. And on each turn, you have 1 compulsory action and 2 optional actions. And the optional actions can be taken either before or after your compulsory action. But every turn you must do a compulsory action. And the compulsory action is going to be, well, let me show you your little expedition board here first. So this board up here, I normally keep them down here, but just so you can see it better, represents my expedition. And it's made up of various boats that I'm taking along the river. I have one little outrigger canoe with a Native American in it, and I can get more to place here later on. And then I have currently one little boat full of resources. You start out the game with these 3 resources. And then I have space over here to store even more resources. And over the course of the game, I can expand my expedition, putting more room for Native Americans or more room for resources. So, on your turn, when you have your mandatory action, it has to either be playing a card from your hand or taking a Native American who you have in your expedition group and sending them out to the Native American village to do something. And when they go to the Native American village, you get whatever is in this worker placement spot, but the person you place there stays there. And that's both a good and bad thing, as you will see as I describe the rules in more detail. So, the placing Native American on the worker placement spot is sort of the secondary action. So let's describe the primary action of playing a card. So you have, as I said, these 6 cards in your hand. You also have all of these cards. You can't see it, but there's a thick stack of additional cards that might come out during the game. And these are characters that you can recruit to join your expedition. So, in addition to the hand management aspect, there's also a bit of a deck building aspect of the game. But again, this is something that you could pretty much completely ignore. You could have a very viable strategy that just uses these primary characters that you start out with and very clever use of the worker placement spaces. So, if you play a character from your hand, you have to first choose a character card and then activate it. So, on its own, a card has 0 activations. You have to have at least a strength of one activation in order to play the card. How do you get a strength of an activation? Well, you place a Native American to activate the card. Each Native American figure on the card that you played is one activation. But you only start the game with one Native American, so what are you going to do? You can't possibly play all of these cards, because once you've played the guy to activate the thing, he stays there for the rest of the round. Well, on the back of each card are more of these Native American figures, and these represent one activation each. For each of the filled-in little spaces, it's one activation. Each card has a maximum strength of 3 activations. You can never exceed that, no matter how you get the activations. Most of the cards in your hand have 2 activations if you play them to activate another card. And that's shown by the number on the top left corner of each character. That shows if you play this face down to activate another card, that's how many activations you would get. And you can combine those. So you can say, okay, I'm going to take this card, which gives me 2 activations, and combine it with this Native American to get 3 activations of this character. So that's how playing cards works. What do these cards actually do? There's 4 really basic cards that are easy to understand, and then there's these 2 more complex but really crucial cards. So I'm going to explain the 4 basic cards first. Now these are basically your resource generation cards. You have 1 hunter, 1 trapper, 1 lumberjack, and 1, what do they call him? It's like a craftsman. Let's see what they call him. He is a blacksmith. Okay, and these all get you the resource that is shown on the left side of the card. Whenever you activate a card, you get whatever is shown on the left column here, multiplied by the number of activations. So, if I played this card like so, I would get 1 meat, because this guy gives me a meat for every activation of the card. So your hunter gets you meat, your fur trader or trapper gets you fur, your lumberjack gets you wood, although this guy doesn't look like he's going to get me much of anything, because he's a bit of a lazy bum. Your blacksmith gets you equipment. So, right here you have the sort of the crux of the hand management aspect of this game, because, as you can tell, you're not going to get enough Native Americans to use the actual meeples to activate these cards as much as you want to. You're going to have to use other cards in your hand to activate them. But as soon as you use another card in your hand to activate it, you don't get that card that you played face down to activate this one. So, even with just these 4 cards, you can see you're going to have to make some tough decisions every round about which cards you play face down to activate the ones that you're playing for their effect. If I play the fur trader face down, I'm not going to get any more fur this round unless I have another card that gives me fur. Now there's one more aspect of these resource generation cards that is important to know, and that is that they give you, the amount of resources that they give you is the strength of the activation, which is how many Native Americans are here, multiplied by the number of resource badges in your area, or the players to your left and right. So, let's say I have played this card, and I have played another card previously in the same round. Well, let's say I have played this, let's say I've gotten this card in my hand, and I've played him previously. So I have this already face up in my play area from a previous round, and then I'm going to play the blacksmith. So I have one activation multiplied by the number of matching resource badges for the equipment resource. So I get one from the blacksmith, but I also have this one from the card that I had played earlier. And as long as these cards are face up in front of you, which means you had played them sometime during this round, they contribute to when you take this resource generation action. But of course, you can't do this and then play this guy again later on and get the same badge, because he's already in your play area. You can't get him back until you pick up all of your cards and take them back into your hand. But in a 2 or more player game, you do also get to count the cards that are face up in the play areas to your left and right. So that is another really cool aspect of the game, is there's this timing element. Let me put this guy back, where you don't want to play your resource generation card first. You want to wait for somebody else to play their resource generation card so that you get the little boost from them having it face up in their play area. And you also want to worry about the timing of when do you take the cards back into your hand, which happens when you make camp, which I'll describe soon. When do you take the cards back into your hand, which would not only allow you to play these cards again, but it also denies your opponents to the left and right the ability to get the boost out of the cards that you have face up in your play area. Now, every character in the game is going to have one of these resource badges, even if they're not a resource generation card. So that's one element that you might want to think about when you're doing the deck building aspect of the game. As you pick up these cards, not just look at what their actual effect is on the left-hand column, but also what resource badge they give you, so that you can start building a strong engine to generate that type of resource. Okay, so those are the basic resource generating characters. Everybody has the same 4 of those. And in addition, everybody starts with these 2 extra basic characters, which are a little bit more complex. And we'll start with your expedition leader, or commander, they're called in the rules. And the commander, in addition to giving you a fur resource badge to boost your fur generation, he lets you basically move along on the river. That's his only job. So when you play this guy, for each activation of the card, you can either spend 1 meat to move 2 spaces forward on the river, spend 1 canoe to move 4 spaces forward on the river, or spend 1 horse to move 2 spaces forward on the mountains. Now remember, you only get to do this once per activation. So if you want to spend 2 canoes, you need to be able to get 2 activations of this card. So that's the commander. The rules recommend you do not trade out your commander. You don't cull him from your deck unless you're super familiar with the game, because this is your basic means of moving forward in the game. You can get other cards that help you do that, but in case one of them doesn't come out, you want to hold on to this guy until you have a better alternative. And finally, we have the interpreter. And the interpreter is the only card in your starting hand that really deals with the Native Americans in this village. So what the interpreter does, it's multi-step. And he's really powerful because he gets you, as I will soon show you, he gets you more Native Americans into your expedition. But he's also, if you don't use him in that round, he's the only starting card that gives you a strength of 2 to activate a different card. When you play the Interpreter, you play him, activate him with however many activations. Let's just say I did this. And a few things happen, and as depicted on this card. First, okay, let's say earlier in this round I had played this Native American to this space in the village, and I had gotten whatever the effect of that worker's placement space. Then, when I play the Interpreter, 3 things happen in order. First, we have a powwow. So all Native Americans on the village, no matter who put them there, get added to the powwow space. Now, the game always starts with one Native American in the welcome space, the newcomer space. And whenever you use this powwow action, you put another one out. This space can never be empty unless you run out of Native Americans in the reserve. The number of Native Americans in the reserve depends on the number of players. In a one-player game, there are only 6. So you can have a maximum of 6 Native Americans in the game at one time. So, they were like this. First thing I do is they all have a powwow. Now remember I said that it doesn't matter who placed them here. As you can see, they're all of one color. It's not like you have Native American meeples in your player color. So, there's another element of sort of interaction in the game. Not only when you play cards are you giving potential resource badges to the other players, but whenever you use a worker placement spot, you're essentially giving those Native Americans to whoever plays the Interpreter first. So, no matter who put them there, they all go to the powwow space. Then, the player who played this card can take as many of these as he wants, doesn't have to take any, can take as many as he wants, and put them into his expedition. Then, a new one comes out into the welcome space, the newcomer space, as I said, and finally, the bottom card from the card offer gets discarded. So this is out of the game, then everything shifts down and we draw a new one. So, a minor element of the Interpreter card is that it cycles these cards out. But really, the main reason you're doing it is to get more of these Native Americans to power your other card activations, or to use these worker placement spots. If you had activated it with strength of more than 1, you do the same thing again. So the second time you do it, you're not going to get a whole lot of Native Americans in the powwow space, you just get 1 extra from the guy who came out into the newcomer space the last time you activated it. And you get to cycle through this a little bit more. Which is, it's not always a completely useless action to activate that multiple times. Especially in a one-player game, you want to get these reserve guys out so you can start using them sooner in the game. However, notice that I said you can take as many of these guys in the powwow space as you want. Why would you want to take fewer than the maximum? Well, that comes into play when it's time to rest and make camp. When you make camp, as I mentioned, you have your scout who's somewhere on the board. You might have to move him back several spaces, and then you move your camp marker up. And remember, the goal is to get your camp marker up to Fort Clatsop. So, how many spaces do you have to move back along the river? That depends on how encumbered your expedition is. If you just have the basic starting setup, you don't really have to move back at all. These boards have really nice iconography on them. Basically, each one of these little sun-moon symbols is one space that you have to move back. So, this starting boat that can carry 3 resources doesn't have any sun-moon symbol above it. So if this is full, or it's empty, doesn't matter, you don't have to move back. Same with this little outrigger canoe that can hold 1 Native American. Now in this game, whenever there is a full circle, it can hold 1 meeple. And that is true whether it's a worker placement space or whether it's part of your expedition. If there's a semicircle, such as this powwow space, some of these worker placement spaces, or this space here, it can hold as many Native Americans as you want. So, alright, let's just pile them all on here. But then you look up here and it shows a sun and moon symbol and the little Native American symbol next to it, which means for every guy in this space, you move back 1 space on the river. So that's how much time you lose for all of these extra boats in your expedition. So if I had it like here, and I made camp, I would have to move 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces back before I made camp. That's not that great, because that's as much, basically I'm losing as much as a full movement with the canoe. Same thing is true for the boats that hold resources. The first boat that can hold resources, you lose 1 day if there's anything in that boat. Doesn't matter if it's full or only has 1 thing in it, you lose 1 day if that boat has anything in it. The next one, you lose a day for each resource in this boat. So you really don't want to have anything in here or in there. You can increase the size of your expedition, as I mentioned before, by putting these other additional boats out, and they follow the exact same iconography as this one. As you can see, it's a complete circle, so it can hold 1 Native American figure, but it doesn't have the sun or moon icon. So this guy is just like your starting boat. It can hold 1 guy, but it doesn't encumber you at all. You don't move backward for it. On the flip side of this, when you buy this, you can do either one. On the flip side of this, there's 3 boats that are just like this small resource holding boat. 3 little canoes that can each hold 1 Native American, but if any of them are full, you move back 1 space. Same thing here. You can get an additional boat that holds 2 resources but doesn't move you back at all, or a boat that can hold up to 5 resources, but if any of them are full, move you back 1 day. Both of those options are still better than these ones you start out with, but on the flip side, they do cost you money and activations, or resources and activations, in order to get them. Alright, so finally, when you make camp, you have cards in your hand that might possibly move you back. As you see on the back side of each card, they all have a sun or moon icon. Now this gets covered up if you play the card face down to power something, so that's fine. Any card that you play, whether face down or face up, doesn't make you lose time when you make camp. However, when you make camp, if you have any cards left in your hand, you turn them all face down, and you lose 1 day for each card left in your hand, which can really add up, especially if you also have resources in your expedition. So you really want to be efficient. You don't want to have to make camp if you're going to have to lose a lot of days, which means you really want to play, whether face up or face down, every card in your deck each time you go through your deck. At the same time, you don't get to use these cards again until you've made camp and taken them back into your hand. So, if I really need fur, I might be tempted to make camp even though I'm going to lose 2 days for these cards I still have in my hand. So I can just play that, just so I can play that fur generating card again. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this rules explanation that you have 1 mandatory action and 2 optional actions that you can take each turn. Resting and making camp is one of the 2 optional actions, and I just described that in pretty good detail. The other optional action is recruiting new people into your expedition, and that costs resources and fur. Or not resources, equipment and fur. And like I said, you can think of these equipment as any sort of trade goods. So for instance, if I wanted to take John Newman, the salad dressing entrepreneur, into my expedition, it would cost me a number of equipment resources equal to the number on his top left corner of his card, which is a 1. The higher the strength of the card, remember these numbers in the top left corner represent how many activations you'll get if you play this card face down. The higher the strength of the card, the more equipment it's going to cost. And the amount of fur that I have to pay is basically how far away from the front it is. So that's another reason why you want to play this interpreter to cycle the first one out and move everything down. It makes them a little cheaper in terms of fur, although their equipment cost is always going to stay the same. There is, however, one way that you can reduce the equipment cost. When you purchase a new character, when you recruit a new character as a free action, remember this is an optional action that you have to take, you may take before your mandatory action or after it, you can discard a card out of your hand. And the number in the top left corner of the card that you discard gets, it's basically a discount that you get for the card that you're buying. And it discounts the equipment cost. You always have to pay the full fur cost unless you have a character that has something special to do with that. But you can discard 1 and only 1 card from your hand to reduce the equipment cost that you have to pay to get a new character. So this has multiple benefits. Not only does it reduce the cost of getting that character, maybe letting you get them on an earlier round than you otherwise would have, but it also lets you trim your deck. Remember, this is a hand management game and a deck building game. And remember that each card in your deck is a card you're going to have to play before you make camp. So if you get a really good engine going, you want to get these cards out of your deck so that you can play, just these 4 cards and then make camp, then play the 4 cards again, make camp, play the 4 cards again. You get a really quick movement along the river once you get that combo going. So you can always discard a card to reduce the cost when recruiting a guy. However, when I say discard, I mean discard it up here, off to the side of the board, and it is removed from the game permanently. So it's not like you just discard it and you get it back when you make camp. You get these guys out of your deck for the rest of the game. And as far as I know, there's no way to get discarded cards back, so you gotta be a little careful when you do that. So those are your 2 optional actions that you can take in addition to your mandatory action. And remember, you can do either of those before or after your mandatory action. If at any time you cannot take your mandatory action because you have no cards in your hand, or you have a card in your hand but you can't power it, then you must make camp before you take your mandatory action. So there's no getting out of taking a mandatory action. You have to do it every turn. Choosing when to make camp is a big part of the strategy of the game. Okay, I've described all of the cards, I've described the optional actions. Now I'm going to briefly describe each of these worker placement spaces. Luckily, there's far fewer worker placement spaces than there are characters in the game, so I can describe these fairly quickly. These are pretty self-explanatory for the most part if you can get used to the iconography of the game. So, instead of playing a card, as your mandatory action, if you have any Native American meeples in your expedition, you can place them on any one of these worker placement spaces and get whatever you get, and the Native American meeple stays there until somebody uses an interpreter to get him back. So, starting from the top left, and we're just going to go around clockwise, you can go to this hunting tent and get 1 meat and 1 fur resource. Pretty simple. You can go to this craftsmanship tent and get 1 equipment and 1 wood. You can go to what's called the gift tent, and you get, this is sort of like you're trading with the Native Americans, get 2 fur or 2 wood. Alright, things get a little more complicated after that. Over here, this is called farewell. And you can see this little art of the people, with their rucksacks on, getting ready to leave the village and go somewhere else. When you put a worker in farewell, you get to do 2 things. First, you may discard up to 3 cards from your hand. And remember, discarded cards go here and are out of the game. And then you must take all of the cards from the offer, discard them all, and completely replenish the offer. So if there's just nothing good on here and nobody else is buying it to cycle it out, this is the action you want to take. Also to trim your deck later in the game. Here, you have a possible 2 worker placement action. I should state that when you do a worker placement action, you get to place 1 worker. Unless you're placing him in a spot, of which there are only 2, that is a semicircle. And remember, semicircles can accommodate more than 1 worker. So if you are placing in a semicircle spot, you can place up to 3 workers, just like you can have up to 3 points of activation when playing a card. So, and most of these, remember, a full circle only has room for 1 worker in it, so most of these, when you place the guy, nobody else can place them until somebody uses an interpreter. So that's another way that using an interpreter can be beneficial. Even if you're not planning on getting the guys out of the powwow space, it frees up a space for you to use it again. It's just like making camp, really, for the cards in your hand. That's why I said at the beginning of this intro to the game, you can build a pretty viable strategy completely ignoring the cards for the most part and just really spamming these worker placement spaces. They're not as good as some of these upgraded characters, but they're actually better than most of the basic characters. You can get 2 fur for just 1 Native American meeple, get your interpreter to get the guy back into your thing, do it again, and keep doing that until you have whatever resources you need for whatever action you're trying to take. In any case, I was about to talk about over here, which is basically you're building, I think it's called raft building. You're building new elements to add onto your expedition board. And I already described what these do and why it's beneficial to have them. It costs 3 wood resources, and you get to pick up one of these. And there are 2 worker placement spaces here, so up to 2 people, or the same person twice, can activate these. Whenever you take one, you must choose which side you want to use, and then you add it onto your expedition board. In addition to getting that extra boat, you always get this prize listed on the top. If you're adding spaces for new Native Americans, you get 1 Native American meeple. that is taken, I believe, just from the supply. If you are adding new resource boats, you get 2 resources of any basic type. Can't get the horses or the canoes. Over here, this is the fortune teller space, and this is a really interesting one. Or I believe it's called shamanism. It's a really interesting one, and I've heard, I'm not an expert at this game by any means, but I've heard that this is sort of really crucial to doing really well at the game. You pay 1 meat, and you can activate with 1 strength any face-up character that has been played to anybody's player area. In a solo game, that's just going to be you, and you can activate your own characters with it. And remember, it's with a strength of 1, so you can't put multiple workers down here to do multiple activations. But, for instance, this wouldn't actually be that useful, but you could spend 1 meat to activate this hunter again and get 1 meat back. It would be more useful if you had multiple resource badges that you were getting to multiply by the strength of your activation. So that is one way, without having to make camp, of using the same character multiple times or using a character that somebody else has recruited. And finally, we have the 2 big ones that can hold up to 3 workers, and you can place up to 3 workers each time you place here, getting horses or getting canoes. And I already explained what horses and canoes do. The horses cost 3 resources. That actually doesn't matter if they're basic or advanced transformed resources. 3 resources of different colors. So, fur, meat, equipment, canoe, another horse, and fur. I don't know why you do that. Maybe you have a character who boosts it. In any case, 3 resources of different types get you 1 horse. So horses are way more expensive than canoes, which cost you 2 wood. And remember, a canoe with your basic commander moves you up 4 spaces on the river. A horse only moves you 2 spaces on the mountains, and they're damned expensive, but what else are you going to do? You got to move on those mountains, or you're going to get left behind. So, that is the game of Lewis and Clark, The Expedition, in a nutshell. You play cards from your hand to achieve various effects. You place Native Americans in the village or use them to power up cards from your hand. You try to move forward on the river and try not to move back too many spaces when you make camp. You try to expand your expedition if you want to. You try to get these canoes to move forward, these horses to move through the mountains. And as I said at the very beginning, it's a pretty unique game. I've really never seen anything quite like this hybrid of worker placement and hand management / deck building. It's just completely one of a kind. And as I've said before, one really cool thing about the game is that despite all of the different, one might say incompatible gameplay elements in the game, you know, it's almost as though the worker placement and the hand management are 2 different games that just happen to be both giving you progress toward the same goal. You can really focus on whatever you want, depending on what everyone else is doing and depending on what's available in the offer. You can build up a really big expedition in terms of getting a lot of cards in your hand, so you can play lots of cards before you have to make camp, and potentially progress much farther along the river if you can get more cards that let you move before you have to make camp. You can do the opposite and focus on getting a really small and tight and efficient hand of cards, so you can make camp constantly and keep reusing the same cards to get that really steady progress along the river. You can try to be super efficient with your actions, make sure you use all of your cards before you make camp, make sure you don't have any Native Americans or any excess resources in your expedition board, so that whenever you make camp, you don't have to move back. Or you can focus on just moving far enough ahead that when you do move back, it doesn't really matter. Or you can focus on getting these little tiles that expand your expedition board so you have more flexibility to carry a whole bunch of stuff and still not move back. There are so many different ways that you can play this game, and depending on what everyone else is doing, depending on what's available in the offer, you could have luck with any of these methods. So that is what's really cool about this game, and I'm really looking forward to getting into the actual gameplay video. But there's one thing I still haven't described, and that is how the solo variant works. So you might really be wondering, how could a solo variant of this game possibly work? Because with the resource badges, and with trying to time when to make camp compared to what everyone else is doing, with putting the Native Americans into the village and having those then be available to the other players to get into their own expeditions, there are so many elements of interactivity in the multiplayer game. You would think that this would not make a very good solitaire game, but it actually makes an excellent solitaire game, and with only a few minor tweaks. So I'll describe those briefly here. The main thing is that you, as usual, have your own scout on the river and your own camp token, and then you choose one scout of a different color. They don't get a camp token, and this represents Alexander Mackenzie. And Alexander Mackenzie was a Scottish explorer who was actually the first European to successfully find a route through the Northwest Passage across the United States north of Mexico. He did it in the, I believe, the late 18th century, whereas Lewis and Clark expedition, as I mentioned previously, was in 1803. So this guy did it in like the 1790s. Which is really cool thematically because you are trying to beat Alexander Mackenzie to get to Fort Clatsop. So that's pretty cool thematically, because you're trying to, in the solo game, beat Alexander Mackenzie to complete this passage across America. And unlike a regular player, he doesn't have a camp. He doesn't have to make camp. He doesn't lose time. He doesn't have to spend any resources to move ahead on the river. All he does is, after each of your turns, every turn in the game, his scout moves forward one space. Whether it's a river, whether it's a mountain, he moves forward one space after each of your turns. And this might sound really weak, because with a canoe you can move forward 4 spaces. But remember, it's taking you multiple actions to get the wood needed to get the canoe, and then you have to place the Native Americans to get the canoe, and then you have to play the card to move ahead, and you have to worry about maybe moving back if your expedition is too full. And meanwhile, he's just moving ahead one space every turn. So that is the core element of the solitaire game. And there's one more element that the publisher was cool enough to actually produce these little chits that are only used in the solitaire game. And that is, as I mentioned previously, in a multiplayer game, when you use these resource collection actions, you are not only getting resources for the resource badges in your play area, but also the players to your left and right. Obviously, in a solo game, there are no players to your left and right. So these, I believe there's 8 of them, yeah. These 8 resource badges go out onto the board at the beginning of the game. And they go into the Native American village. And on the back of each of these is a little illustration showing you which space they move to when you place them out. So these always are in the same spaces at the beginning of the game. And when you use a resource collection action, if there is a Native American meeple in a space on the board that has the matching resource badge, you act as though, that resource badge was in the play area of the player to your left or right. So if I were to choose to gather wood, and I had already made canoes, and I had already expanded my expedition, either in this round or a previous round, because remember, these guys stay there until you use your interpreter, then when I do this, I get the one resource badge for him, there, and then depending on how much I power it up, if I did this, I would get 2 times 3 and get 6 wood instead of just 1 wood for playing the card normally. So that is the main difference in the solo game. And while it doesn't completely encompass the interactivity of the multiplayer game, and the really brain-burning timing of when are you going to play your resource cards to get the stuff that you need but not benefit the other players, and when are you going to make camp to get these cards back, not only because you want to play them again, but also to prevent other people from piggybacking off of your cards. It doesn't quite have that element of uncertainty to it. It still does create a lot of complexity in terms of when are you going to play your interpreter to get these Native Americans back off of the board. Because once they're in the powwow space, even if you don't take them, they're not on these spaces to generate the resource badges. How long are you going to let these guys sit out there where you don't have access to that Native American anymore, but they're generating that extra resource badge for you? So that is the one additional element of the solo game. Other than that, everything is exactly the same. And I think that is all. I have to apologize. It has been a really long weekend, and I wanted to get this out there before Columbus Day, also known as Indigenous Peoples of America Day. So I may have repeated myself a little bit more than usual, maybe tripped over my words a little bit more than usual, although really that is not unusual for me. But I hope that if you're new to the game, you found this rules explanation, although exhaustive and time-consuming, I hope that you found it useful. And I will see you on the other side when we get straight into the playthrough. And again, there's going to be a link at the bottom there, below the video. And I will see you there, and we'll see if we can beat that Scott to the Pacific Ocean.